Ideas have consequences. Our thoughts become our actions. And for that reason, it's so important that we're deliberate about what kinds of things we're thinking about and ingesting and digesting so that we have good ideas and produce better fruit in our lives and in our choices. At least for me, books are a big part of how I try to put new ideas in my head. I can't think of a better person to talk to about books than Bob Turner. Bob is the library director at the Harding School of Theology. He also works at the White Station Church of Christ as a member of their preaching team. I was thrilled to get to have a conversation with Bob about some of the books that have been coming out, some trends that we're seeing, and maybe some books that we ought to be paying attention to. Thanks for tuning in today. Bob, I appreciate you making time to talk to me today.
Great to be here, Mark. Happy to talk.
Well, I have a lot of love for the Harding School of Theology. Enjoyed studying there, and I know the library is certainly one of their great assets there for every program that they have. And so I thought it would be neat to talk to you a little bit about some of the resources that are available in terms of books and literature, just because you've got such a good front row seat on a lot of the things coming out. So I guess one question I'd like to ask, what would be some of your favorite books that you've seen maybe in the last year or two? And in particular, I'm also interested in hearing about, are there any books that are coming out that are really good that maybe aren't getting as much attention as they deserve?
Yeah, one that I've been talking about a lot lately that I'm teaching on at my class that I teach at church, and I've been sending some newsletter out, is Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, The Coddling of the American Mind.
Right.
And it's 13 chapters or so. Each one of them is about a different issue about not one of these youth culture bashing books about young people these days. It's not one of those. This is a book that's not addressing the topic of how are younger people ruining our culture. Instead, it's asking the question of how is our culture ruining young people. People are estimating that in certain age brackets, people born since 1995 are more depressed than ever before and are contemplating suicide at higher rates than ever before.
Right.
I think it's a pretty serious topic.
Yeah.
So that one comes immediately to mind. I've read it. I've taught on it now. I don't know, Mark, have you read it?
Yeah, in fact, I finished reading it last week. My wife and I were listening to it in the car. We had a short trip we were on, and the Audible version came with my Kindle purchase. And we were listening to it in the car. And when we got home, she was just kind of wringing her fists and saying, this is in some ways, the information in the book is so irritating. But at the same time, one of the things I appreciated is how, they just lay the research out there on, here's what's happened. Here's what seems to be different. I loved what they lay out as like the three great untruths, the things that we need to be pushing back on. But I thought it had a great payoff in the last couple of chapters where they moved from here's all the problems to here are some really productive, fruitful steps you could take to begin addressing this. So,
yeah, I kind of put it in the realm of like the great book about when I read Fast Food Nation about how bad we were eating, or when I read Dave Ramsey about how much debt we're taking out. Every one of us is going to wrestle with this. It's a universal struggle. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that all of us can't make some changes. And I've already made some in my own personal life.
Yeah.
And everybody can too. It's easy for us to look at our friends and talk about what overprotective parents they are. But at the end of the day, there's a few things all of us can do. Another book that kind of came closely with that I think of that came out last year, not this year, was Andy Crouch's Tech Wise Family.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah, now that's one I have not gotten to read. I was talking with someone who has a fair amount of expertise on this subject. He felt like Crouch is laying out a pretty rigorous level of expectation. So like Crouch is kind of throwing down the gauntlet, and probably no one can fully live up to the gauntlet, but maybe there's some good steps to take in that direction.
Yeah, Crouch is like suggesting CrossFit for somebody the day after Thanksgiving. Yeah. I mean, it's just that's not where to go. No TV in the house. Take a day off every week of no electronics. Take a week of every year off, no electronics, no devices. That said, oh man, like it's like all of us can find 2 or 3 habits that we could quickly change even if it's a simple thing like not looking at a device the very first thing you do in the morning. I mean, what a
Yeah.
change that would be. That book came to mind. It's kind of in the same way. It's not a research-based book. It's a experientially based thing from his own life. I think he's right. Everyone's going to have to figure out how to fit it
Yeah.
in their own rhythm.
Yeah.
That came out that I really liked, and it's not really about ministry. It's about leadership. Was The Culture Code by Daniel Croyle.
Okay.
I don't know if you've come across this
No,
one.
I'm not familiar with that one.
This is in that kind of Harvard Business School style of reading that you hear about on some of the podcasts and things. And it's just kind of slogan based. Here's some slogans to run your business about. I thought he had some really, really nice things about building culture.
Okay.
And if I'm a minister right now, I'm reading this. I'm thinking about how to build healthy cultures. We're thinking about our library staff here, in our School of Theology faculty, but even in a church context, when you look at these things and think about, man, how do we build healthy cultures?
Yeah.
Daniel Croyle's book was phenomenal.
Yeah. So do you have familiarity? I know we already mentioned Andy Crouch. Do you have some familiarity with his older book on culture making?
Yeah, that's right. It's funny.
Would you say it's kind of in the same vein? I mean, is it something similar to that? Does it do anything that Crouch's book didn't do?
No. I would say Crouch's book is kind of a thicker philosophical presentation of that, whereas Daniel Croyle is he kind of embedded himself in a few different groups: the San Antonio Spurs, Google, the Navy SEALs.
Wow.
And some different organizations that are known for being kind of like sustained excellence.
Yeah.
And what he wanted to look at was what are practices within healthy cultures. And so he came down on things like that. In a healthy culture, there's a shared sense of vulnerability, that everybody in the culture is both responsible for the success, but also, kind of vulnerable to failure. And so there's a shared sense of that. Healthy cultures all have a really clear set of what the expectations are and what the mission is. As you're reading that, it's like, it makes sense. It's like, this is how church organisms work.
Yeah.
And churches get in a bad place when people realize that people aren't on the hook for things. We haven't financially invested ourselves or emotionally invested ourselves, and we can walk out the door and leave at any moment.
Yeah.
That's when things start crumbling. It's when we're invested.
Right. So it sounds like you're saying, like, I guess, and remembering Crouch's book, it is a fairly thick read, so he kind of lays out a good philosophy, but this is more of a book that is dove pretty deeply into places where this has been done well. And it sounds to me like maybe a good book suggestion for ministry staffs and probably also with elderships. It seems like a lot of times when something's more connected to the world people are living in, they have an easier time accepting it. Because I know with the theology stuff, we can pretty quickly take people off the deep end before they really want to. So.
Oh, for sure. So you're in Texas, so we can think about this. Like San Antonio Spurs, Greg Popovich has he has a culture with his team where he found out they have a lot of international players. They always have. And food is one thing that brought them together. And he's a real appreciator of fine wine, Popovich is. And he found out that that's something that everybody in the world can talk about and appreciate. And so he made a policy with his team years ago that after every single game, win or lose, they were going to have a meal together. He would choose a great meal in whatever city they were in. 2 or 3 hours after the game, you're expected to show up as part of the culture. It's not mandatory, but it is highly expected.
Okay.
And it came into play 2014 Finals, Game 6. Ray Allen hits the corner three that brought the Heat back, and they were absolutely devastated. The Spurs had such a chance to put the nail in the coffin. They were devastated. They weren't going to come back from that. And 2 or 3 hours later, at the restaurant, Popovich is sitting there waiting for his 15 guys to roll in.
Yeah,
it's the culture.
Right.
It's who we are. You don't make excuses. The teamwork, the brotherhood comes first. I thought it was amazing. I thought, how many people in church life and congregational life have that kind of resilience to put family first?
Yeah, resilience is a good word for that. I just finished reading a book a couple of weeks ago, last name Clear, Atomic Habits, and kind of in a similar vein. Yeah, really, really enjoyed it. And it's not the only book out there on habits. I've been intending to read the James K.A. Smith book about You Are What You Love. I know that's one I need to read, but I
Right.
just happened to start with this one. And yeah, thinking about the value of systems. So when you're talking about a culture, I think there's some similarity there to, what is our way of being? What are the things we're going to keep in place? Because it is in paying attention to the system, the culture, the way of being, that over time it is shaping us into who we are. So there's got to be some significance to that. So
No, I was having a conversation with a really well-known church consultant recently about some stuff, and we were asking the question, how many, when churches have problems and people are tempted to leave, or kind of people, you're going through a dry spell,
mhm.
how many people who leave were involved in a small group?
Yeah.
I would love to see the numbers of
Mhm.
people who were invested in a tight community. I bet they leave at much smaller percentages.
Right.
That's been my experience. I would guess that's probably statistically reliable too.
Yeah, I would expect so. I know that. I would point to my own setting, and even if I've got someone who's coming regularly to worship, if I know they're not plugged into any Bible class or any life group, I'm never surprised when they suddenly stop showing up. So you're right. Yeah, there's
It's
kind
called
of a culture. Culture is a good word for that. So okay, so that's another one you've recommended. Are there some others that are coming to mind that you would say are especially worthy of consideration?
I saw. It's a little thicker. If you want to dive into something pretty heavy, there's a book it came out last year, between 2 years ago, or this year or last year, called Exile. It's by a guy, James Scott. It's a reflection on the work of N.T. Wright, this
Mm.
hypothesis he has that Israel viewed itself as being in exile during the time of Jesus.
Hmm.
And he brought in all of these big shot scholars. We're thinking Walter Brueggemann, Scott
Yeah.
McKnight, Loveday Alexander, these sorts of people, and say, hey, let's kind of hit this one around. Pretty good read, pretty
Yeah.
thick. It's one of those ones you read 4 pages in bed and then you fall asleep really and
Okay.
sleep well.
Okay.
So it's a multiple purpose book.
Yeah.
It's a good thing, and anyone who's talking and pushing back and receiving from NT Wright right now, in my opinion, is doing the right thing, because he's right at the front. I
Hmm.
mean, he's the superstar among us. So
Right, right. So would you suggest? I guess one thing I was wanting to ask you about. There's a lot of us who, when we're in seminary, when we're working on degrees, and we have professors saying, you must read this, you must do this. It's a little easier to stay motivated, to stay on top of your scholarship. So I was interested in hearing from you some, and that book you just mentioned may be a good example of this, but. For those of us who don't have the benefit of staying heavily in scholarship, can't read every journal, can't be in the middle of it all. I'm interested if you could point to a few resources that you'd say, hey, if you can only read a few things, here'd be some stuff, here'd be some ones to pay attention to. Sounds like that one might be a good one to take a look at.
yeah, I mean, I know this sounds weird, but you can always just sign up for publishers' catalogs. They'll send them to you for free.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
know that's a weird thing. It is a lot of paper to be coming through, but that you can sign up for. I would stay away from email alerts. They just get really overwhelming, and
Yeah.
they end up hiding good stuff in your email that you need to actually read to do your job. Um, I send out a newsletter for ministers called Footnotes. That's
Yes.
part of the mission of what I'm doing, is trying to keep ministers kind of with one foot still in their theological library they might have experienced during graduate school and seminary, and because it is hard. I walk into a building every day that has 150,000 theological books. Most people don't have the privilege of that.
Right.
Um, there is. I mean, some people read through the blogs. I don't think as many people are doing kind of book focused work there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see as much of that.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, you can like stuff on Facebook. If you like the publishers and stuff, they'll kind of show something your way, but it's
Right.
not curated in the way that I would like. They're trying to sell you a
Mm-hmm.
product, so it's not necessarily what you'd be interested in.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. So let's talk about Footnotes a little more, because and how often are you sending this out?
yeah, it comes out twice a month.
Yeah, twice a month.
Ideally
Okay.
on a Monday afternoon, twice a month. And this is a curated newsletter thinking about Christian leaders, church leaders, and trying to ask the question of kind of what does a person who is in ministry kind of, trying to keep their head above water, how could they benefit from a theological librarian kind of
Mm-hmm.
just sending out resources, helping them in some of the stuff they might have missed.
Right.
And kind of giving voice to some of the conversations that are happening, bringing in resources to chime in on things, and doing it in a way, I call it curated, which is like not just bombarding you with a fire hose worth of information, but me kind of selecting things that I think for a special constituency. Not everyone who subscribes to the list is a minister in the Churches of Christ or an elder in the Churches of Christ, but a lot of them are. So I have a little more heightened sensitivity to that constituency.
Sure. Yeah, and one of the things I've enjoyed about it, as you mentioned, it's not kind of a fire hose approach. I've had the experience in the past of some professors are better than others. I've had some guys I've been able to email and say, hey, working on this, could you send me a few suggestions, who've sent me just a really good, sharp list I could work with. But, you have some that will send you the 4-page front and back, 200 items, which, of course, I don't even know where to begin. So I've appreciated that with footnotes, you're giving, you're often placing a high emphasis on like a specific book or a topic. Like I know you did some stuff on the Enneagram. You've been doing the coddling of the American mind. And I've also appreciated the way you've been trying to bring in some good conversation partners. So I know you've also, a lot of times, I guess you're doing this in kind of a scripted form. You'll find someone pretty sharp on a subject and you guys will go back and forth a little bit.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it's just, I think with the resources thing, one of the number one questions I get if I interact with church leaders, if they're on campus, particularly elders, is they know the topics, they don't know who the resources are.
Yeah.
And so right now, like every church leader is like, we would love for someone to come in, I shouldn't say every church leader, but some church leaders will contact us and say, we would love for someone to talk with our parents about how their kids are more sympathetic to LGBT concerns than they are, and certainly their grandparents are.
Right.
The elder knows the topic. They do not know the resources.
Right.
And so to help them figure out the resources is really, really helpful for them. And so I think that's a valuable thing we're able to do by showing these different conversations. And the good thing is a lot of them are out of my area that I know much about, but I can ask good questions.
Right.
And so we're able to bring people in on a variety of things. So, I mean, I think the first thing we did, when I started back in February, I think that was when Me Too splashed.
Wow.
And I didn't know much about the hashtag Me Too and all this stuff. We brought in people who knew way more about that topic than I did. So we've been able to continue to just try to provide resources. And that'll continue. The topics always change.
Yeah. It's interesting the way that you framed that because so often when I've talked to people about theological education, what you just said is exactly the reason I'll say mine has been valuable to me. Because I don't know, there's lots of stuff I know almost nothing about, but one thing I've gotten pretty good at is finding answers. And so once you know who some good names are, some good resources are, those first couple of steps can take you a long way in finding good information.
And it's interesting too because I was speaking with a church recently about a consultant they'd had 15 years ago or something, and I mean those glimpses they get, those small experiences can be so good and so bad.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, it will frame the way they think about something for better or worse. And so recommending resources is some of the most important work we can do. And I'm privileged that I get to work in the middle of a lot of them, and we have really good financial support to be able to do that. And it's probably the number one service we provide for churches is just the familiarity we have with what's going on. I went to the Society of Biblical Literature meeting 2 or 3 weeks ago, which is also the largest book exhibit of theological books in the world each year. And so just getting to go around and walk and look at the tables and take notes and take pictures and then obviously purchase a lot.
Yeah.
It's almost like going as a reporter on behalf of people and saying, like, I'm going to go and figure out everything that was going on here. And then over the next 12 months, kind of package it and bring it back for you. Right.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a great place to get to spend some time. So.
Yeah, it was pretty awesome.
Yeah. Well, hey, let's. You're talking about some different resources coming out. What would you say are some trending topics that we're seeing a lot of? Like when you look at the stuff that's rolling off the presses, what are some of the things everybody's writing about these days?
Yeah, definitely things that maybe in the past would have been located in sociology is front and center with theology. So anything that's going to deal with gender, with sexuality, with race relations, and with socioeconomic issues, I think that's right where it is right now. It is not I would say right now in the publishing industry, those are not topics. Those are the middle of what's being written on.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think when James Cone died within the past year, and his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, I mean, I think it exploded on Amazon sales. I was speaking with someone about that. So this is front and center for what people are reading in theology right now. They're not secondary interests at all.
Right. Yeah. So a lot of the stuff related to social justice, those kinds of issues, and I mean, I guess to some degree, even some of the books like the Jonathan Haidt book we were talking about earlier, I mean, really ties into that conversation as well. So I guess the stuff that's happening in theological circles is largely reflective of what's going on in the culture at large as well.
I think that's right. I would say in churches probably whereas maybe 2 generations ago people were very topically minded on these different doctrinal topics. I think right now we're topically minded too, except maybe they've trended a little more towards what that generation would consider social topics. But I think people are viewing them in an incredibly theological way. So they are theological topics. They matter for people. They matter for God.
Yeah. Yeah. So are there any specific resources in some of those areas you would say, hey, here's a really good book or two you ought to consider if you're wanting to learn more about some of those types of topics you mentioned earlier?
That's a good question. I would say we bought a lot recently. There's one that I'm not going to remember, but recently we bought one from Chalice Press on church leaders confronting racism, and I can't remember her name. But she wrote it, and it's a book about why it's so hard for white people to talk about race, but it's in a church context.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be reading that with some of our church leaders in the next few months because I think it's really not just a book about the topic, but a book about our place within the topic.
Yeah.
Why is this awkward? I think some of the standards, though. I was noticing Ronald Sider's book, Just Generosity, I think is like 25 or 30 years old. And that was the one that I read in graduate school. Not that long. I read in grad school on poverty. I still think is as good as any of them in terms of kind of the social justice angle. But he has a few different approaches than some others would. I haven't done as much recently focusing on what the better ones are on the LGBTQ topic. You might know some on those. I can't think of anyone that's. I saw you recommended Sally Gary's book.
Yeah, I enjoyed Sally's book a lot. Yeah,
hers is a memoir style.
Right. Yeah, why don't you? I know you and I had kind of an email exchange as we were talking about some things we might discuss, and you were mentioning some kinds of things coming out. And I know you mentioned the memoir approach. There's quite a bit of literature coming out these days that uses kind of a memoir approach. So yeah, Sally's book I would say is an example of excellence in that category that was really helpful to me. But why don't you talk about some of the things you're seeing with things like memoirs? What are some of the benefits? What are some good things? What are some things that maybe they're turning a blind eye to?
Yeah, I thought she did a really good job too. So memoir is one of the most compelling genres to write in because the story in so many ways is indisputable. People can write with a level of conviction that is difficult to write on if you write in another manner where you have to deal with a bunch of different points of data and different sides of a topic.
Right. Documenting sources and such. Yeah.
Right. A memoir can have 100% conviction. And so that can be really compelling to read. Also, a memoir has 100% kind of sense of investment and feeling because you're reading a person who has walked this story out their entire life. And that's really compelling that a person isn't just doing this as an academic exercise, but you feel as you read it that you're viewing 100% of what the person has experienced. For those two reasons, I think it's worth reading memoirs. I have some serious reservations with memoirs in terms of the best way to explore a topic.
Yeah.
They're not built the same way that something that's written by a reporter might be. And so I think about, for example, the book Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, where he went to Middle America, talked about the changes in the economy of Middletown, Ohio. And he tells his story of growing up there. Well, his story is true. It did happen. I don't doubt it happens. I've seen that happen in many people's lives. In terms of kind of what that means for the larger topic of the U.S. economy and jobs and social welfare programs and all of these things, I don't know. I mean, J.D. Vance makes some nice points. I mean, I think he has experienced this. I don't know. I mean, economists can't agree on this. I don't know that one person's perspective, just because they experienced it, necessarily means that. And so we can see
Right.
this with memoirs. We have people right now who are writing for the Wall Street Journal or writing for the New York Times, which are ideologically different,
Right.
who were both raised in poverty, who are both a person of color, who are making very opposite proposals for how to fix some of our problems. Well, both of them lived it.
Hmm.
You can't, so I know it's easy for us to say, but you can't argue with them. That's their story. Well, it is their story. That doesn't mean that their solution is the best comprehensive coverage of the topic. So I just think
Yeah.
memoir can be a little narrow.
Right.
I like them. I'm amazed how many of them have become like the definitive book on a topic.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been fascinating to me how a lot of works when someone just kind of lays out there some type of a personal manifesto, like you say, it's kind of hard to argue with, and it's written with great emotion and conviction. But yeah, maybe there are sometimes more data to be considered as part of the decision making process, and yeah, they have kind of a tendency maybe to overdo it on the subjectivity of the reasoning.
For sure. And I mean, I think right now, we can talk about church, but there are people writing this, this memoir genre of this is why I left this church, this is
Yeah.
why I left. And there's other people who are writing the exact same content saying that's the reason I stayed.
Right.
Well, okay. I mean,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah,
more
you're
to be
right.
reported.
Yeah, there's a lot to explore there. So,
Yeah.
So, so on the one hand, I guess we talked a little bit about memoirs, and I know one of the things that every minister, and I think a lot of people who at least teach in church contexts, Bible class teachers and elders and whatnot, I think we're all always having to draw from good commentaries, good resources on the
Mhm.
text itself. So, could you talk a little bit about commentaries? Are you seeing any particular trends with scriptural
Yeah.
commentaries? I mean, I feel like there's a lot of them rolling off the press, and they've all kind of got their
Yeah.
specific lens. So, talk
There's
a little bit about that.
Right. Okay. So commentaries are historically like the best way to write about the Bible. They've existed since, commentaries have existed as long as the Bible has existed.
Hmm.
As long as we've had scripture, we've had people commenting on it, and that's
Yeah.
fantastic. And so you can go and read Origen's commentaries or whatever, Luther's commentaries and West, whatever. So I love it. I think publishers, we need to, as a librarian who is kind of trying to navigate through hard times, I think publishers are doing the exact same thing right now, and they're trying to figure out what can they write that people will buy.
Yeah.
I asked a publisher a few years ago, what kind of books are you looking for? And he looked at me, and this is an academic publisher. He looked at me and said, honestly, we'd like to find something like The Shack, which is him saying, we'll publish anything, but we would love for it to sell 1 million copies.
Right.
So that's kind of where publishers are. They're trying to find something that sells. And right now, one of the best ways to sell something is the business model that says if you can sell person one book, and then because it's in a series, you can compel them to buy the other 27
Right.
volume commentary. That's a good way to help sales.
Hmm.
And so that's probably why the commentary has proliferated.
Hmm.
So that each of the North American theological publishers, when you think about Baker and Zondervan and
Yeah.
InterVarsity Press, they all have multiple series,
Right.
and they're good, and
Right.
they're finding good people to write them. But I do think the market vulnerability might explain a little bit of why there's so many.
Hmm.
And so then within that, I think we want to ask some questions about like, well, okay, if there's so many, like, what is it in a commentary that you do value?
Hmm.
Have you seen Craig Keener's commentary on Acts?
Yeah, I don't think I could hardly lift it off the table. Yeah, Kevin Burr, a good friend of mine, is and I think Kevin. Yeah, he's been studying under Keener, and I know I was getting ready to do an Acts series a couple of years ago in preaching, and I looked at the Keener volumes. It's like, man, I really need to get those, and I need to read those. But boy, they're impressive, really impressive.
It's like, we did the math. In his 4 volumes, there is a total of nearly 60,000 footnotes.
Wow.
So that might be for you.
Right.
Carl Holliday put out his entry in the Acts in the in the New Testament library through Westminster John Knox.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's 350 pages. I used it for sermon prep recently, and I thought it was fantastic.
Good.
So I guess it depends on what your needs are.
Right.
But just to show variety, Keener has more footnotes than Holiday has text.
That's amazing. So now I know you mentioned their approach is, I guess, since commentaries are kind of a bread and butter thing, like everybody wants to know what the Bible means. That's, I guess, like the safest bet on what people would actually purchase. And you talked about the way that people would kind of think, if I buy one in a series, I might as well go ahead and try and get the set. But is that an approach you would generally recommend for commentaries? I mean, is that the approach? I mean, I know that's what they're hoping people will do, but
they're hoping.
Do you find with commentaries that, are there any series you think have got a good consistency of quality? Because that's not always been my experience.
It's not. There's a few series that I think have done a pretty good job because they have a different scope. I mean, the two that I would recommend if people were going to go out and buy, the NIV application commentary, they're all applicable. They all have nice inserts and pictures and things to kind of bring a layperson into reading the text. So that as a series is pretty good. I also think the Smith and Helwis Bible commentary, all of them have the same interactive angle where they have a lot of different pictures from antiquity and things like that I think are really helpful. Mm-hmm. Other than that, on the critical commentaries, there's some really good lists put out. My predecessor, Don Meredith, who worked here for 49 years, he kept an anthology of all the rankings of commentaries that were done, all the lists. He kept a list, which was a compendium of all of those, mm-hmm. and produced his own. We haven't updated it since 2010, but it's a great list to help people figure out their way around the commentary market, because it's just not a good investment of money to buy everything. And if you kind of figure out what the best ones are in each place, mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. I mean, I used his name already today, but the interpretation series is known as More Practical.
Yeah.
But the Genesis commentary is by Walter Brueggemann.
Yeah.
And it's considered to be one of the most helpful theological commentaries on Genesis.
Right.
So sometimes, you find some really nice pieces that otherwise you might not have. But I don't know that you would follow that commentary through the whole Hebrew Bible.
Right. Yeah. Well, as you were talking, I know the interpretation series has been out for a few years, but yeah, that was actually one I was thinking of, where I've got a couple of volumes of the interpretation. I think Fred Craddock has done a couple of those in the New Testament part, and I would point to him as like, best commentaries I own on that book. And then just assuming that there's a few other commentaries I bought and I tried to use, and it was like, I can't do anything with this. So there was...
Yeah. And, weird stuff happens where they sign a contract with somebody and they get sick, or their GA finishes. I mean, these interesting. And so when you think about that, you don't have that quite as much with the book market. If a book doesn't get finished, it just doesn't get finished. But right. Commentaries, when they're doing series and they sign people up to do these things 10 years in advance, it opens the system up to some real quirks.
Right. Yeah. It's like you must finish. So, yeah.
Right.
Another one I have enjoyed a lot, the Brazos Press, kind of the theological commentaries. I've been enjoying some of the attempts to bridge that gap between the theologians and the exegetes. Like there's seeming to be some neat, productive work happening there. And that series, again, I haven't loved all the ones I've purchased, but there have been mm-hmm. several that have been just really rich, kind of fresh takes on the text that I hadn't thought of.
I think Stanley Hauerwas wrote on Matthew.
I believe so.
Which is fun because he likes the Sermon on the Mount.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going to get there and he kind of gets to explode there. And I think that's where it kind of also you want comment. I mean, that's one of the problems with commentaries is they're not unique. Mm-hmm. And so you're reading one and you're like, I'm not sure if I'm in the Erdman's commentary or the Zondervan or the Baker or whatever. But so they can get kind of boring. Mm-hmm. But if you're reading and Stanley Hauerwas gets to go and start, doing good stuff in the Sermon on the Mount, this is really good, mm-hmm. even if it's not exegetically exactly what you would find elsewhere. Mm-hmm. I think they had Yaroslav Pelikan write on Acts, and maybe it's the same story where it's like this great historian. I think that's who they had. Yeah, we ought to be having fun with this. Mm-hmm. One of the best commentaries from a creative kind of swing for the fences angle I don't know if you read Colossians Remixed.
I heard about it. That's one I've kind of had on my list. I haven't read it yet. I know
Yeah.
some people I talked to who I respect kind of felt, yeah, some of them loved it, some of them hated it. So yeah, that's one I'm interested in, but I haven't read it.
Well, it's not boring,
Hmm.
and but yeah, it was one of these things where they're like, we're going to do a new thing in the commentary genre, and you take it or leave it. Because there's so many commentaries, they can get a little pedantic at points,
Hmm.
and also, as you know, like they just start arguing with each other,
Yeah.
and some of us just look from the outside, and you feel like you're like peeking in through a window at a Thanksgiving dinner for somebody who's not your family,
Right.
and you're like, it's fun to watch, but only to watch. I'm not sure what I'm getting out of this.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah. So kind of on a related note, something I'm kind of working on for my own reading for next year. I'd made up my mind. I wanted to read through a couple of different New Testament translations, and so I know I've got the David Bentley Hart New Testament one, and
Yeah.
then I've also got the N.T. Wright one. And I loved
Yeah.
it when these two guys started, kind of going at each other. Not
Right.
necessarily big fans of each other's text. So I thought, I'm going to enjoy reading both of those translations and trying to see what they do different. But any particular Bible
Yeah.
translations you think are interesting that are coming out?
Sorry. Yeah. I wanted to mention there. I guess that was N.T. Wright wrote a review of David Bentley Hart in
Right,
the Christian Century, and
right.
then David Bentley Hart responded with a blog. And all of you who are listening to this, you must go out and read
Yeah,
these because they
I'll
are
link to it. I'll
great.
be sure to link to it below. Yeah.
Please, Bible translations. You know what? I don't know.
Hmm.
We acquired both of the ones you just held up,
Uh huh.
but I haven't actually. I looked through the N.T. Wright thing. I think he does some things that kind of reflect his kind of position in the New Testament and kingship
Right.
and some other things. But I mean, I was good with David Bentley Hart. I had fun reading his defense of why he did what he did, but I haven't
Hmm.
actually used his New Testament at all.
Right.
I find him all kinds of fascinating. I mean,
Right. Yeah.
I can
He's
see
Eastern
that guy out.
Orthodox, isn't he?
Yeah, I guess.
Right.
I would recommend to everybody listening to this and watching. There's an issue of First Things from about 2 or 3 years ago where he suggested 25 lesser known books that he thinks
Oh.
people should read. Do
Okay.
you remember seeing this?
No. No.
I felt so dumb. I hadn't heard of any of the 25, and I walked it around to people that I know who are pretty good literary minds, and they hadn't heard of any of the 25.
Okay.
And so I just want to throw this out there for any of you to see if you have even heard of, much less read, any of the 25 of David Bentley Hart's lesser known recommendations.
Okay. I guess this is part of what makes him who he is, right? Just the different angle on things.
Yeah, I think his collection is something like 20,000 books. So he is an interesting collector. Yeah.
Sure. Sure. So, Bob, one other question I've got, and you may not have much on this one, but I'm just kind of curious. I mean, as a person who is kind of on the front lines of a lot of the types of books and writings and publications coming out, like, are there some books that you're not seeing that you would love to see? I mean, are there some types of writing, some approaches to some issues? Are there some things you feel that are lacking you wish someone would write?
Yeah. I would say this. If I can speak to like the Church of Christ
Sure.
context right now,
Sure.
I'm I mean, disappointed is not the right word, but the lack of kind of reporting we're doing right now. I think the Christian Chronicle does a great job trying to send people out and do reporting and find out what's actually going on. They do a great job.
Mhm.
I was even interested, though, in their most recent issue, they had an editorial about how they had some cancellations and subscriptions because of some reporting they had done.
Hmm.
I don't see a lot of hunger for actual journalism
Wow.
where people get out and cover stories and tell kind of long form stories about things. I'm not seeing much of that at all.
Hmm.
Most of the publications seem to have resigned themselves to being just writing kind of like 1,000 word devotional pieces or
Yeah.
word studies.
Hmm.
And I wish there was a little more reporting. I will say this. I read in the Great Commission Research Journal last month, Stan Gramberg
Yeah.
has a piece on population decline in churches of Christ and the need for church planting and the problems. It's fantastic. It's
Oh, yeah.
data. He was in here doing a lot of his research. I think we should be doing 10 times more of that. I think actual reporting and quantitative statistical research of these things is going to go a lot farther than kind of just a lot of repackaged sermonettes. in our publications. And I'd love to see Christian colleges, I think some of them are doing this, but I'd love to see them use some of the resources to fund projects to study these things. I just think this is really critical, that we actually get some data around these things, and just doesn't all become kind of anecdotal storytelling about what's going on.
Right, right. Well, that's a nice challenge. Yeah, that's something that would take some effort, but would probably produce some good fruit as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, and there's some good things. The Abilene Christian does a survey of ministers.
Yeah, the minister salary survey, right? Mm-hmm.
Some others in the past have done. I mean, I think some of the doctoral projects are actually doing the best work. So I think some of the people writing doctoral projects are doing quantitative studies. They're interviewing people. They're doing large sample sizes. I'm trying to figure out how to get some of that stuff popularized. I'm thinking, like, what could we do to popularize that, to bring it to market, so to speak? Because the dissertation is valuable.
Right.
But if there was ways we could bring those findings, I mean, I'm thinking about Anessa Westbrook at Harding, who wrote this really great piece on spiritual formation among women, females,
right,
and asked them the question about, before a woman hits the age of 18 and goes to college, what before that in her life shapes her receptivity to spiritual formation, and how many female mentors does she have in her life? I mean, this is great stuff. I'm copying pages of registrations, sending it to people, but it's not like it's ready to be distributed big time.
Yeah, as you bring that up, that's really for me been a driving force behind what I'm trying to do with my own, video blog series like this one. So I've been trying to highlight and working on doing, I'm in contact with a few other people I'm going to be featuring where, I think you're exactly right. I think a lot of our Doctor of Ministry students are producing excellent original research that is pragmatic, it's church focused. But what I found is, at least for me, that the downside has been, because to do a Doctor of Ministry, I'm by necessity involved in active ministry. I'm way too busy to try and publish anything. And so, I've been hoping with at least some kind of a video interview like this, we can have space to flesh out some of the things that people are learning. Because, I don't believe anyone, I think from my own congregation, maybe 3 people have read the dissertation that I wrote about them. So it's not something I think people are diving into in its current format. But the ideas that are there, I think you're right. I think there's something we could be tapping into and doing more with. And that's weighing on me a lot, because I think there's a lot of good ideas we could be getting out there.
There's a lot. And I think you nailed it. When we come to the point where we're asking people to read doctoral dissertations, we can know that we've really lost our way.
Yeah.
But somehow to bring, a lot of the great research out there, particularly ministry studies, started in dissertation form, because you had the incentive to do the work and do the research. And I think we just need to keep putting an emphasis on getting some actual data. And I know Churches of Christ are a loose-knit collection of folks. And so data collection has not been our thing. But I would say, if we have any interest in surviving the next 10 years, and Granberg's article gives the impression that might not be as easy as it sounds, we're going to want to have the actual some consensus around what the truth is of the situation.
Yes. Well, Bob, I don't have any other questions that I'm presently thinking of. Is there anything else related to our conversation that you'd want to throw out there or mention? Any additional resources or things you'd want people to be looking into?
Oh, I don't know. One thing I think is helpful, a lot of people are using to keep track of their stuff, is like Evernote and Zotero and some of these software platforms. A lot of people have contacted us and expressed how much they use those and how much they appreciate them. We do some Zotero training with people if we ever have an opportunity here. It's the free one, and so it's the easiest one to teach our students. But it's part of their introduction to graduate work here, is that they do get in tutorials and expectations to use Zotero. That's the best way I know to stay organized on these things.
Okay.
Is to keep something on your computer relative to the organization of materials. So I would recommend that.
Great. Well, Bob, I really enjoyed this conversation. Always enjoy any chance I get to visit with you and catch up. I don't make it to Memphis too often these days.
Well, hey, remember, barbecue still comes from a pig and not from a cow.
I actually had brisket for lunch today, so yeah.
You're always welcome. Whatever that is, sounds delicious. And
I'm a Tennessean, so by nature, but yeah.
You are.
Yeah, originally from Nashville, so I've learned to kind of appreciate both. But yeah, well, Bob, it's been a pleasure visiting with you, and appreciate you making time to have this conversation today.
Great work, Mark. Thanks for doing this.